The ballroom of Ashford Manor glittered like a jewel box under the light of 1,000 candles. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the polished marble floors, where London's finest society swirled in elaborate gowns and pristine evening wear. It was the event of the season, Lord Ashford's annual Masquerade ball, and every ambitious mamma had dragged her daughters here in hopes of securing an advantageous match. Miss Eleanor Hartley stood at the edge of the ballroom, her mask doing little to hide the mixture of boredom and dread on her face. At 23, she was considered firmly on the shelf by society's cruel standards. Her younger sister, Caroline, had married a baronet 2 seasons ago, and now Elena was the subject of pitying glances and whispered conversations. "You look as though you'd rather be anywhere else," came a familiar voice. Elena turned to find her closest friend, Lady Beatrice Thornton, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. Beatrice was everything Elena was not, petite, golden-haired, and married to a wealthy earl who adored her. "You know me too well," Elena replied, accepting the glass gratefully. "I don't know why I let Mother convince me to attend. It's the same faces, the same dances, the same crushing disappointment," Beatrice finished with a sympathetic smile. "Perhaps tonight will be different. It is a masquerade after all. Mystery and intrigue could be lurking around any corner. The only mystery here is why anyone would willingly subject themselves to this charade year after year." Beatrice's eyes suddenly lit with mischief. "Speaking of charades, have you seen him yet?" "Seen whom?" "The tall gentleman by the terrace doors, all in black. He's been standing there for the past half hour and not a single woman has approached him. It's quite extraordinary, really. Even the most desperate debutantes have given him a wide berth." Elena's gaze followed Beatrice's subtle gesture. There, half hidden in the shadows near the French doors leading to the garden, stood a man unlike any other in the room. He was tall, imposingly so, with broad shoulders that filled out his black evening coat perfectly. His mask was simple black silk, but it couldn't hide the sharp line of his jaw or the way he held himself with an air of quiet authority that seemed to push others away. "Who is he?" Elena asked, curiosity piqued despite herself. "No one seems to know. He arrived alone, spoke to no one, and has been watching the room like a hawk ever since. Some say he's a foreign dignitary. Others whisper he's a criminal hiding from the law. Lady Pemberton is convinced he's the ghost of the old earl, returned to haunt the halls." Elena laughed. "Lady Pemberton thinks everything is a ghost." "True enough, but there's something about him, isn't there? Something that makes even the bravest souls think twice about an introduction." "Elena, darling, I have the most wonderful idea," Beatrice said, her voice taking on a tone Elena knew all too well. It was the tone that had gotten them both into trouble more times than she could count during their school days. "No, you haven't even heard what it is yet." "I don't need to. That voice means mischief, and I'm too old for mischief." "Nonsense, you're never too old for mischief." Beatrice leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I dare you to dance with him." Elena's eyes widened. "You cannot be serious." "I am perfectly serious. Look at you, Elena. You're brilliant, beautiful, and utterly wasted standing here like a wallflower. You claim to be bored with society's games, yet you play by all the rules. Here's your chance to do something unexpected, something daring." "Approaching a strange man and demanding a dance is not daring, Beatrice, it's scandalous. It's a masquerade. The entire point is to be someone you're not, if only for one night. Besides, it's not as though anyone will recognize you in that mask, and if it all goes horribly wrong, you can simply disappear into the crowd." Elena bit her lip, glancing back at the mysterious figure. He had returned his attention to the General Assembly, seemingly content to remain in his shadowy corner. There was something almost lonely about his isolation, she thought, as though he had built walls around himself and dared anyone to try to breach them. "What would I even say to him?" she asked, already feeling her resistance crumbling. Beatrice grinned triumphantly. "You'll think of something, you always do. Come now, Elena, when was the last time you did something truly spontaneous, something just for yourself?" The question hung in the air between them. Elena couldn't remember. Her life had become a series of obligations and expectations, caring for her aging father, managing the household while her mother plotted impossible matches, being the dutiful daughter, the proper lady. When had she last felt truly alive? "Fine," she heard herself say, surprising even herself. "But if this ends in disaster, I'm blaming you entirely." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Beatrice said, squeezing her hand. Now go before you lose your nerve, and Elena, don't forget to enjoy yourself." With her heart pounding in her chest, Elena set down her champagne glass and began to make her way across the ballroom. The crowd seemed to part before her, or perhaps she was simply too focused on her destination to notice the people she passed. Each step brought her closer to the mysterious stranger, and with each step her courage wavered. What was she doing? This was madness, absolute madness. But she didn't stop. As she approached, she could see more details that had been hidden from across the room. His evening clothes were impeccably tailored, speaking of wealth and status. His hands, resting casually at his sides, were strong and elegant. And though his mask concealed much of his face, she could see dark hair touched with silver at the temples and lips pressed into a firm, almost stern line. He noticed her approach when she was still several feet away. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle tension entering his frame. When she stopped directly in front of him, she could feel the full force of his attention, and it was overwhelming. "Good evening," she managed, proud that her voice didn't shake. He inclined his head slightly but said nothing. His eyes, she could see now they were a striking grey, like storm clouds, regarded her with cool assessment. Elena's mind raced. What had she planned to say? All the clever opening lines she'd rehearsed in the 30 seconds it had taken to cross the room had fled her mind entirely. "I find myself in need of a dancing partner," she said finally, deciding that directness was her best approach. "And you appear to be unoccupied." Still, he said nothing. His silence was unnerving, but Elena refused to be cowed. She lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze with what she hoped was confidence rather than desperation. "I realize this is unconventional," she continued. "But then, this is a masquerade. Isn't the entire point to break with convention?" The corner of his mouth twitched, whether in amusement or irritation she couldn't tell. "I do not dance," he said finally. His voice was deep and rich, with a cultured accent that spoke of excellent breeding. But there was also a roughness to it, as though he rarely used it. "Everyone dances," Elena countered. "Or at least everyone at a ball dances." "Then I am the exception." "How disappointing, and here I thought you might be interesting." That got a reaction. His eyes narrowed slightly and she could feel the intensity of his focus sharpen. "You know nothing about me, madam." "Precisely my point. I was hoping dancing might remedy that. But if you prefer to skulk in corners all evening, far be it from me to disturb your solitude." She turned to leave, half relieved to escape what was quickly becoming an embarrassing encounter. But before she could take more than a step, his voice stopped her. "Wait." Elena paused, turning back to face him. He was regarding her with something that might have been curiosity or perhaps suspicion. It was difficult to tell with the mask. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why what?" "Why approach me? There are dozens of suitable partners in this room, any of whom would be delighted to dance with you. Why seek out the one man who clearly wishes to be left alone?" It was a fair question. Elena considered it, searching for the truth amid the tangle of impulses that had brought her here. "Because," she said slowly, "everyone else is so terribly predictable. And you, sir, are at least interestingly rude." To her surprise, he laughed, a short, sharp sound that seemed to catch even him off guard. "Interestingly rude? I don't believe I've ever been described quite that way before. And there's a first time for everything, including perhaps dancing." He studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the distinct impression she was being measured against some invisible standard. Then, without warning, he extended his hand. "One dance," he said, "and then you will leave me in peace." "One dance," Elena agreed, placing her gloved hand in his, "though I make no promises about the peace." His hand was warm through the thin fabric of her glove, his grip firm but not crushing. As he led her toward the dance floor, Elena felt Beatrice's eyes on her from across the room and resisted the urge to look back. She had accepted the dare. Now she would see it through. The orchestra was beginning a waltz as they took their positions. His hand settled at her waist, and Elena placed hers on his shoulder, acutely aware of the solidness of him, the restrained power in his frame. This close, she caught the faint scent of sandalwood and something else, leather perhaps and the night air. "You have the advantage of me," he said as they began to move. "You know why I'm here, lurking in corners and refusing to dance, but I know nothing of you save that you are either very brave or very foolish." "Can't I be both?" "Most people are neither." They moved together surprisingly well, despite his claim not to dance. His lead was confident, his steps sure. Elena found herself relaxing into the rhythm, letting him guide her across the floor. "You dance very well for someone who doesn't dance," she observed. "One learns many useless skills in the course of a lifetime. And yet you use them when properly motivated. What motivated you tonight, I wonder? My charm, my persistence, or merely the novelty of being called interestingly rude?" Another flash of what might have been amusement crossed his features. "Perhaps I simply wish to see what manner of woman would be bold enough to approach me." "And have you satisfied your curiosity?" "Quite the opposite. You've raised far more questions than you've answered." They swept past other couples, and Elena couldn't help but notice the stares they were attracting. Let them look, she thought with a defiance that surprised her. Let them whisper. For once in her life she was doing exactly as she pleased, consequences be damned. "You're not what I expected," her partner said, drawing her attention back to him. "What did you expect?" "Someone seeking scandal or social advancement. The usual motivations for approaching a stranger at a ball." "How very cynical of you." "Experience has made me so." "Then your experience has been limited. Not everyone is driven by such mercenary concerns." "No, then what drives you, mysterious lady?" Elena considered the question. What had driven her? Boredom, curiosity, the need to feel something other than the dull ache of predictability that had colored her life for so long. "The same thing that drives most people, I suppose," she said finally. "The desire to feel alive, to do something unexpected, to be surprised by life rather than simply enduring it." His hand tightened slightly at her waist, and his grey eyes searched her face as though trying to see past her mask to the truth beneath. "That is either the most honest answer I've ever received," he said slowly, "or the most skillfully calculated lie." "Does it matter which?" "Perhaps not. This is a masquerade after all. Perhaps we're all pretending to be someone we're not." "And who are you pretending to be?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment his careful composure slipped, and Elena glimpsed something raw and vulnerable beneath the surface. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by his usual guarded expression. "Someone who belongs here," he said quietly, "though I suspect I'm failing miserably." "I think you're doing better than you realize," Elena replied, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. "After all, you're dancing. That's more than you were doing 10 minutes ago." "True, though I'm beginning to question the wisdom of allowing myself to be goaded into it." "Regretting it already." "I didn't say that." The waltz was coming to an end, and Elena felt a strange pang of disappointment. One dance, they had agreed. She should honour that agreement, thank him politely, and return to Beatrice with tales of her brief adventure. But she didn't want to. As the final notes faded and they came to a stop, neither of them immediately stepped apart. They stood there, hands still clasped, close enough that Elena could see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes, the tiny scar near his left eyebrow that the mask didn't quite conceal. "Thank you for the dance," she said, forcing herself to release his hand and step back. "I hope it wasn't too terrible." "It was," he paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Unexpected." "I'll choose to take that as a compliment." "As well you should." He bowed formally, but there was something less rigid in his manner now, as though the dance had thawed some of his coldness. "May I know your name, or does the masquerade forbid even that?" Elena hesitated. This was the moment where the fantasy could end, where the magic of anonymity could be preserved. Or she could take the risk, make herself known, and face whatever consequences followed. "Elena," she said, offering only her Christian name, "and yours." His expression shuttered immediately, the walls slamming back into place with almost physical force. "That's not important." "Not important, or not something you wish to share?" "Both, neither." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that spoke of frustration or perhaps weariness. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Elena. You've certainly made the evening more memorable than I anticipated." It was clearly a dismissal, but Elena found herself reluctant to accept it. "Will you be attending the garden party tomorrow? Lady Ashford is hosting a luncheon." "No." The word was final, absolute. Elena flinched despite herself. "I see. Well then I suppose this is goodbye." "I suppose it is." She should leave. The sensible thing would be to curtsy, turn away, and forget this strange interlude ever happened. But Eleanor Hartley had spent her entire life doing the sensible thing, and look where it had gotten her. "You know," she said, taking a step closer to him and lowering her voice so only he could hear. "For someone who claims not to dance, not to belong, and not to want company, you seem remarkably comfortable in mine. Which makes me wonder if perhaps you're not being entirely honest with yourself." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she'd pushed too far. But then, to her surprise, he laughed again, that same short, sharp sound that seemed to escape against his will. "You are either the bravest woman I've ever met," he said, shaking his head, "or the most foolish. I haven't decided which." "Why not both?" Eleanor replied with a smile. "You said yourself most people are neither. Perhaps I'm simply determined to be extraordinary." "You may very well succeed." With that cryptic comment, he bowed again and turned away, disappearing into the crowd with a swiftness that left Eleanor staring after him in confusion. She had the distinct impression she'd just been part of something significant, though she couldn't have said exactly what. "Well," Beatrice appeared at her elbow, practically vibrating with curiosity. "Tell me everything. Who is he? What did you talk about? Did he step on your toes?" "I don't know, surprisingly little, and no," Eleanor replied, still watching the spot where the mysterious stranger had vanished. "He was unusual." "Unusual good or unusual bad?" "I'm not certain there's a difference." Beatrice looped her arm through Eleanor's, steering her toward the refreshment table. "You're being deliberately cryptic, which means it went well. Come, you must tell me every detail, and don't leave anything out. I want to hear about every word, every look, every—" "Beatrice, there's really not much to tell. We danced, we talked briefly, and then he left. That's all." "That's all, Eleanor Hartley, you just waltzed with the most mysterious man in London society, and that's all you have to say. I've never seen you more alive than you looked out there on that dance floor. Something happened." Had something happened? Eleanor wasn't sure. All she knew was that for those few minutes in his arms, she had felt more present, more herself than she had in years. And now that it was over, the ballroom seemed duller somehow, the lights less bright, the music less enchanting. "Perhaps you're right," she admitted quietly. "Perhaps something did happen, but I don't think I understand what yet." The morning sun streaming through Eleanor's bedroom window was far too bright for someone who had spent half the night lying awake, replaying a single dance over and over in her mind. "Miss Eleanor, your mother wishes to see you in the drawing room," her maid, Annie, announced as she pulled back the curtains with ruthless efficiency. "She says it's urgent." Eleanor groaned, pulling a pillow over her face. How urgent could anything possibly be at this hour? "She received a letter, miss. Came by special courier first thing this morning." That was unusual enough to rouse Eleanor's interest. She reluctantly pushed herself upright, accepting the robe Annie held out. "Did she say what it concerned?" "No, miss, but she's in quite a state about it. Been packing the drawing room for the past half hour." Minutes later, properly dressed but still fighting off the haze of too little sleep, Eleanor descended the stairs to find her mother exactly as Annie had described, packing back and forth across the drawing room carpet, a letter clutched in one hand. "Ah, Eleanor, finally. I've been waiting ages." Mrs. Hartley was a handsome woman in her 50s, with the same dark hair and strong features Eleanor had inherited. But where Eleanor tended toward quiet contemplation, her mother was all nervous energy and social ambition. "Annie said you received a letter." Yes, yes, from Lady Ashford. You'll never believe it. The most extraordinary news." Her mother's eyes were bright with excitement, and Eleanor felt a familiar sinking sensation in her stomach. That look usually preceded some new scheme to secure Eleanor an eligible match. "What does Lady Ashford have to say?" "She's specifically invited us to an intimate dinner party tomorrow evening." "Eleanor, do you understand what this means? Lady Ashford never issues personal invitations. One is simply included on the general guest lists for her larger events, but this is different. This is significant." Eleanor accepted the letter her mother thrust at her, scanning the elegant script quickly. Sure enough, it was a personal invitation to dine at Ashford Manor, addressed to both Eleanor and her mother. "I don't understand," Eleanor said slowly. "We barely know Lady Ashford. Why would she single us out?" "Who knows, who cares? This is an opportunity, Eleanor. Lady Ashford's dinner parties are legendary. All the most important people attend. This could be your chance to." "To what, mother?" "Catch the eye of some eligible gentleman who's overlooked me for the past 3 seasons." "Don't be bitter, dear, it doesn't suit you." Mrs. Hartley took the letter back, smoothing it carefully. Besides, you seem to be doing quite well at the masquerade last night. I saw you dancing with that tall gentleman in black. Who was he? Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks. I don't know, we didn't exchange names. You didn't, Elena, how could you be so careless? What if he was someone important? Then I'm sure he would have made himself known. Or perhaps he was being mysterious. Men do that sometimes, you know. They like to test a woman's interest, see if she'll pursue them. Mrs. Hartley's eyes lit up with fresh speculation. Oh, perhaps that's what this invitation is about. Perhaps he was someone of consequence, and Lady Ashford is facilitating another meeting. Mother, that's absurd, it was one dance. I'm sure he's forgotten all about it already. But even as she said the words, Elena wasn't certain she believed them. There had been something in the way he'd looked at her, in the careful way he'd chosen his words, that suggested she'd made more of an impression than she'd realized. We must plan your outfit carefully, her mother was saying, already moving on to practical considerations. Something elegant but not too formal. You want to look approachable but not desperate. Perhaps the blue silk. No, the green brings out your eyes better. We'll need to. Mother, Elena interrupted gently. Perhaps we should wait to see what the evening actually entails before we start planning my wardrobe for a non-existent courtship. Non-existent now, perhaps, but opportunities must be seized, Elena. You're not getting any younger. It was a familiar refrain, one Elena had heard in various forms since her 20th birthday. She was acutely aware that at 23, she was considered past her prime on the marriage market. Most of her contemporaries were married with children by now. But Elena had never been able to muster much enthusiasm for the men her mother paraded before her. Dull younger sons with gambling debts. Agging widowers looking for a nurse more than a wife, ambitious merchants seeking entry to the gentry through an advantageous marriage. But last night had been different. The mysterious stranger in black had been different, and that perhaps was what frightened Elena most of all. The next evening found Elena standing before her mirror, examining her reflection with more care than usual. She had chosen the green silk after all, unable to resist her mother's logic about it complimenting her eyes. Annie had arranged her dark hair in an elegant style, with a few curls artfully framing her face. You look beautiful, miss, Annie said with genuine warmth. Whoever this dinner is for, they'd be a fool not to notice you. Thank you, Annie. Though I suspect this evening will be exactly like every other society dinner I've attended, tedious conversation, mediocre food, and an early escape home. But as their carriage rolled up the long drive to Ashford Manor, Elena couldn't quite suppress the flutter of nervous anticipation in her stomach. The house was ablaze with lights, less grand than it had been for the masquerade but somehow more intimate, more personal. Lady Ashford herself greeted them at the door, a tall, elegant woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Mrs. Hartley, Miss Hartley, so glad you could join us. Please come in, most of our other guests have already arrived. They were led into a drawing room where perhaps a dozen people stood in small groups, making conversation. Elena recognized a few faces from the previous night's ball, but notably absent were the desperate debutantes and their hawk-eyed mothers. This was a different crowd entirely, older, more established, more sophisticated. May I offer you some champagne? Lady Ashford asked, gesturing to a hovering footman. We'll be going in to dinner shortly, but there's time for introductions first. As Elena accepted a glass, she let her gaze wander the room, taking in the assembled guests. There was Lord Pemberton, a distinguished diplomat she'd met briefly at another function. Lady Catherine Blackwood, a widow of means known for her charitable works. Several other lords and ladies whose names Elena knew but whose faces blurred together in the monotony of the social season. And then in the corner by the window, partially obscured by a potted palm, she saw him. The stranger from the ball. He wasn't wearing a mask tonight, and Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. He was even more striking in full view, strong aristocratic features marked by a thin scar near his left temple, dark hair silvering at the temples, and those same penetrating grey eyes that had haunted her dreams. He was deep in conversation with Lord Pemberton, his expression serious, but as if sensing her scrutiny he looked up. Their eyes met across the room, and Elena saw recognition flare in his gaze, followed immediately by something that looked very much like alarm. I see you've spotted our guest of honour, Lady Ashford said quietly beside her, a knowing smile playing at her lips. Guest of honour, Elena managed, unable to tear her eyes away. The Duke of Blackmore, He's just returned from several years abroad. Terribly tragic story, really. His wife died in a riding accident 5 years ago, and he's been in self-imposed exile ever since. This dinner is, in part, a welcome back to society. The Duke of Blackmore. Elena felt the room tilt slightly. The stranger she'd dared to approach, the man she'd danced with so freely, the mysterious figure she'd challenged and teased, was a duke. One of the highest-ranking members of the aristocracy. No wonder he'd been so guarded. No wonder people had given him a wide berth. "Oh dear," Lady Ashford said with entirely too much amusement. "You didn't know, did you? How delightful." We didn't exchange names," Elena whispered, still staring at the Duke, who was now staring back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "So I heard, James, that is, His Grace, mentioned something about an encounter with a persistent young woman at the Masquerade. I must confess I was rather hoping it was you." "You were hoping, why?" "Because, my dear, you're exactly what that man needs. Someone who doesn't know or care about his title. Someone who sees him as simply a person rather than a duke or a tragic widower or any of the other labels society has pinned on him." Lady Ashford patted her arm gently. "Come, let me make a proper introduction." "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." But Lady Ashford was already moving across the room with the determination of a woman on a mission, leaving Elena no choice but to follow or be left standing alone. "Your Grace," Lady Ashford said warmly as they approached, "I don't believe you've been properly introduced to Miss Eleanor Hartley." The Duke turned to face them fully, and Elena could see the tension in his jaw, the careful control he was exerting over his expression. Up close, without the mask and shadows, he was even more imposing than she'd realized, and even more attractive, damn him. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice cool and formal. "What a surprise." "Your Grace," Elena managed, executing what she hoped was a proper curtsy despite her shaking knees. "The surprise is mutual, I assure you." "Oh, you two have met?" Lady Ashford asked innocently, though her eyes sparkled with mischief. "How wonderful, then you'll have plenty to talk about over dinner. Miss Hartley, you're seated next to His Grace, I do hope you don't mind." Mind, Elena was fairly certain she was about to expire from mortification. She'd teased a duke, called him interestingly rude, practically forced him to dance with her. Oh God, she told him he was comfortable in her company and that he wasn't being honest with himself. "Not at all," she heard herself say, even as her internal voice screamed at her to flee. "I'm sure it will be enlightening." "Excellent. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must see to the other guests. James, do try to smile occasionally. You're frightening the poor girl." And with that parting shot, Lady Ashford glided away, leaving Elena alone with the Duke. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things that had been said and not said the previous night. "I suppose," the Duke finally said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "I owe you an explanation." "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. I was the one who intruded on your privacy. The fault, if there is one, is entirely mine." "Is it? You asked my name, and I refused to give it. That seems rather more deceptive than simply approaching a stranger at a ball." "You said your name wasn't important." "A convenient fiction that you were kind enough not to press." He paused, studying her face. "You truly didn't know who I was." "I had no idea, should I have? Most people would have recognized me, mask or no mask. The Duke of Blackmore, recently returned from exile, is quite the topic of speculation among the ton. I don't pay much attention to gossip. Clearly, otherwise you might have been more circumspect about dancing with me." Elena bristled at the implication. "Are you suggesting that I would have behaved differently had I known your title, that I would have fawned over you like every other woman in London?" he finished grimly. "Yes, Miss Hartley, that is exactly what I'm suggesting, because that has been my experience since the moment I set foot back in England." "Then your experience has been limited," Elena shot back, echoing his words from the previous night. "Not everyone is impressed by titles and rank, Your Grace. Some of us are more interested in character." His eyes widened slightly, and Elena could have sworn she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. "You're not intimidated by me at all, are you?" "Should I be? Most people are." "Well, I'm not most people." Elena lifted her chin, meeting his gaze squarely. "I danced with a man last night who was interesting, complex, and more than a little infuriating. The fact that he happens to be a duke doesn't change any of that." Interesting, complex, infuriating. He seemed to taste each word. I've been called many things, Miss Hartley, but rarely those. Perhaps people aren't honest with you. Or perhaps you see things others don't. Before Elena could respond, a footman appeared to announce that dinner was served. The Duke offered his arm with practiced courtesy, and Elena took it, acutely aware of the eyes following them as they processed into the dining room. The dinner table was set with exquisite china and crystal, candles casting a warm glow over the assembled guests. True to Lady Ashford's word, Elena found herself seated to the Duke's right, with Lady Catherine on his left and Lord Pemberton across from them. As the first course was served, a delicate consommé conversation flowed around the table. Lord Pemberton spoke of his recent diplomatic mission to Vienna. Lady Catherine discussed her latest charitable endeavour, a school for orphaned children. The Duke listened politely, contributing the occasional comment but largely remaining quiet. Elena found herself watching him from the corner of her eye, noting the way he held himself with rigid formality, the way his responses were measured and careful. This was not the same man who had laughed unexpectedly at her boldness, who had admitted to pretending to belong. This was the Duke of Blackmore, playing the role expected of him. Miss Hartley, Lady Catherine said warmly, drawing Elena's attention. Lady Ashford tells me you're involved with the Ladies' Education Society. What a wonderful organisation. I've been meaning to increase my own involvement. It's a cause close to my heart, Elena replied. Education should not be the exclusive province of those who can afford it. Every young woman deserves the opportunity to develop her mind. A radical notion, Lord Pemberton observed with a smile. But one I happen to agree with. My own daughters have benefited greatly from their education. Radical only because society fears educated women, Elena said. They're much harder to control when they can think for themselves. She felt the Duke's attention sharpen on her, but when she glanced at him, his expression remained neutral. You speak from experience, I gather, he said quietly. Don't we all? I was fortunate enough to have a father who believed daughters deserved the same education as sons. Not all women are so lucky. And what did you do with this education? Lord Pemberton asked with genuine interest. Beyond advocating for others, of course. I read, Elena said simply. Everything I can get my hands on. Philosophy, history, literature, science. My father's library is extensive, and I've made it my mission to work through every volume. Impressive, Lady Catherine said. I wish more young women had your intellectual curiosity. Curiosity can be dangerous, the Duke murmured, so quietly Elena almost missed it. Dangerous, she echoed, turning to face him fully, or liberating. Often both. Their eyes locked, and Elena felt that same electric awareness she'd experienced on the dance floor. The rest of the table seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them suspended in a moment of understanding. Tell me, Your Grace, she said, deliberately keeping her voice light, do you fear dangerous things, or do you seek them out? I've found, he replied carefully, that dangerous things have a way of finding me, whether I seek them or not. Then perhaps the wise course is to face them head-on rather than hiding in corners. A flash of genuine amusement crossed his face. You're not going to let me forget that, are you? Would you prefer I forget everything about last night? The question hung between them, loaded with implications. The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment Elena thought she'd pushed too far. But then he leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. No, he admitted quietly, I find I wouldn't prefer that at all. Elena's breath caught. Before she could respond, Lady Ashford rose from the head of the table, signalling that it was time for the ladies to withdraw and leave the gentlemen to their port and cigars. As Elena stood, she felt the Duke's hand briefly touch her arm. Miss Hartley, he said, still speaking quietly, would you do me the honour of taking a turn about the gardens after the gentlemen rejoin you? I find I owe you a proper conversation. Only if you promise to be interestingly rude again, Elena replied, unable to resist. And there it was, that surprised laugh she was beginning to treasure. I'll do my best. The gardens at Ashford Manor were spectacular even in the fading light of evening. Carefully manicured hedges created intimate spaces, while lanterns hung from trees cast a soft, romantic glow over winding paths. Elena stood on the terrace, ostensibly admiring the roses, but in reality watching the door and waiting. He'll come, Beatrice said from beside her. Of course Lady Ashford had invited Beatrice. The woman seemed determined to orchestrate every detail of this evening. I'm not sure I want him to, Elena admitted. This is all becoming rather complicated. Complicated is good. Complicated is interesting. Boring is what you've had for the past 3 years, and look where that's gotten you. Peaceful, safe. Stagnant, Beatrice corrected gently. Elena, I've known you since we were children. I've watched you dim your light year after year, trying to fit into the mold society demands. But last night, dancing with him, you were radiant. Don't let fear steal that from you. Before Elena could respond, the terrace doors opened and the gentlemen began to emerge, having finished their port. The Duke was among the last, his tall frame easy to spot even in the gathering darkness. His eyes found hers immediately, and he made his way across the terrace with purposeful strides. Miss Hartley, he said with a formal bow, would you still be amenable to that walk? I would, Your Grace. He offered his arm, and they descended the stone steps into the garden. Behind them, Elena could hear Beatrice's delighted whisper to Lady Catherine, but she didn't look back. For several minutes, they walked in silence, following a path that led away from the house toward a small fountain at the center of the garden. The sound of water provided a soothing backdrop, and Elena found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. I should apologize, the Duke said finally. For my deception last night, it was not well done of me. You didn't deceive me, Elena pointed out. You simply didn't volunteer information I didn't ask for. Perhaps, but I meant what I said earlier. I don't care about your title. I'm more interested in why you felt the need to hide it. He was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his words carefully. When you've been defined by your rank your entire life, there's something liberating about being seen as simply a man. No expectations, no history, just myself. But you are a duke, that's not something you can simply set aside. No, he agreed quietly, though God knows I've tried. They reached the fountain, and the Duke gestured to a nearby bench. Elena sat arranging her skirts, and he settled beside her, careful to maintain a proper distance. Lady Ashford mentioned you've been abroad, Elena ventured, for several years. 5 years in Italy mostly, some time in Greece. That sounds wonderful. I've always wanted to travel. It has its moments. It's also an excellent way to avoid one's responsibilities. The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, and Elena turned to study his profile. In the lantern light, she could see the tension in his jaw, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. You mentioned your wife, she said gently. I'm sorry for your loss. His hands clenched briefly in his lap before he consciously relaxed them. Thank you, though I suspect you've heard the whole sordid story by now. Society does love to gossip about tragedy. I've heard very little actually, only that she died in a riding accident. That's the sanitized version, yes. He paused, seeming to struggle with something internal. The truth is more complicated. Caroline was an accomplished horsewoman, better than I was, certainly. But she was also reckless, always pushing for greater speeds, higher jumps. I asked her repeatedly to be more careful, but she thrived on risk. Elena waited, sensing there was more. The day she died, he continued, his voice rough with emotion, we'd argued. About her riding, about her recklessness, about other things. She stormed out, took her horse and rode off without her groom. They found her 3 hours later. Her neck was broken. She likely died instantly. James, Elena breathed, using his Christian name without thinking. That's horrible. The worst part, he said, finally turning to look at her, is that I blamed myself. If I hadn't argued with her, if I'd gone with her, if I'd stopped her somehow. For years, I carried that guilt like a physical weight. It drove me away from England, from my estates, from my duties. I couldn't bear to be here in the places we'd shared, constantly reminded of my failure to protect her. Elena's heart ached for him. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. He stiffened in surprise but didn't pull away. It wasn't your fault, she said firmly. You couldn't have known what would happen, and you couldn't have controlled her choices even if you'd wanted to. Logically, I know that. I've known it for years. But guilt isn't logical, Miss Hartley. Elena, she corrected. If we're going to discuss dead wives and complicated emotions, I think we can dispense with formality. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Elena then, and you must call me James, or at least when we're alone. In public, I'm afraid the proprieties must be observed. Why did you come back? Elena asked. After 5 years, what changed? Duty primarily. My estates were suffering from my neglect. My tenants deserved better than an absentee landlord, and I suppose— He paused, seeming to search for the right words. I suppose I realized that hiding from grief doesn't make it go away, it simply makes it fester. That's very wise. Or very overdue. I should have returned years ago. But you're here now, that's what matters. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Elena felt the full force of his attention like a physical touch. You're very kind to say so, though I'm not certain kindness is what I deserve. Everyone deserves kindness, James, even tortured dukes with tragic pasts. That surprised another laugh from him. Is that how you see me, a tortured duke? Among other things, you're also stubborn, guarded, and far too hard on yourself. But you're also intelligent, thoughtful, and capable of surprising honesty when you let your guard down. You've formed quite an opinion based on one dance and one dinner. I'm an excellent judge of character. Or dangerously presumptuous. Those aren't mutually exclusive. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands still clasped. Elena marveled at how natural it felt, how right, despite having known this man for less than 48 hours. Elena, James said slowly, I should warn you that pursuing any kind of friendship with me comes with complications. Society will talk, they always do. And given your age and unmarried status, that talk could be damaging to your reputation. Let them talk, Elena said with more bravery than she felt. I'm past the age of caring what society thinks of me. Are you? Because I've found that society's opinions have a way of mattering, even when we wish they didn't. Then perhaps we simply need to be discreet. No need to parade our acquaintance in front of the gossips. You're suggesting a clandestine friendship. I'm suggesting that what happens between us is our business and no one else's. He studied her for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face as though trying to memorize every detail. You realize this is madness. I'm not looking for— I can't offer you. I'm not asking you to offer me anything, Elena interrupted gently. I'm simply suggesting that we might continue to know each other, to talk as we're doing now. Is that really so scandalous? When it's an unmarried woman and a widowed duke, yes, rather. Then we'll be careful, meet in public places, always have chaperones present, follow all the proper rules. Somehow I doubt you're very good at following rules. I can be when I want to be. James laughed again, and Elena realized she was collecting his laughs like treasures, each one a small victory against the darkness she sensed in him. Very well, he said, we'll attempt this complicated friendship and see what becomes of it. But Elena, I want you to know, I can't promise anything beyond friendship. My heart is complicated. I understand, mine is rather complicated as well. It wasn't entirely true. Elena's heart was, she was beginning to realize, remarkably simple in its wants. But she sensed James needed the safety of low expectations, the freedom to explore this connection without the pressure of courtship or marriage looming over them. We should return, James said reluctantly, though he made no move to rise. People will talk if we're gone too long. A few more minutes won't hurt, besides I have questions. Of course you do, you strike me as someone who always has questions. What was Italy like? Greece? I want to hear about the places you've been, the things you've seen. And so he told her. Haltingly at first, then with growing enthusiasm, he described the ruins of Rome, the canals of Venice, the Parthenon gleaming in the Athenian sun. He spoke of art and architecture, of foreign customs and exotic foods, of adventures and misadventures in lands far from England. You should go, he said finally. See all these places yourself, you have the mind for it, the curiosity. Unmarried women don't travel alone, Elena pointed out. And I can't exactly afford a grand tour on my modest allowance. Ridiculous restrictions, why should gender determine who can travel? I agree entirely, but agreeing doesn't change reality. James fell silent, a thoughtful expression on his face. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. What if you had a companion, someone to lend respectability to the venture? Do you know many respectable companions willing to gallivant across Europe with a spinster? I know one duke who's been considering a return to Italy. He finds England rather stifling after so long abroad. Elena's heart skipped a beat. James, you can't possibly be suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything improper, he said quickly. But dukes are allowed to travel with companions provided the proper arrangements are made. A paid companion for you, separate accommodations, always in public. It could be done respectably. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're intelligent, curious, and not intimidated by tortured dukes. I know you make me laugh when I haven't laughed in years. I know that for the first time since Caroline died, I'm actually looking forward to tomorrow instead of simply enduring it. The raw honesty in his voice made Alina's eyes sting with tears. James. Think about it, he urged. We don't have to decide tonight. We barely know each other, as you said. But perhaps over the coming weeks we could see if this friendship is sustainable. And if it is, well, why shouldn't we both have something to look forward to? It was insane, impossible, completely improper despite all his assurances about paid companions and separate accommodations. It was also the most thrilling prospect Elena had entertained in her entire life. I'll think about it, she promised. But James, I need you to be honest with me. Is this truly about friendship, or is there something more you're hoping for? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know, he admitted. All I know is that I haven't felt this alive, this present in 5 years. Whether that's friendship or something more, I can't say. But I'd like the chance to find out, if you're willing to take that risk with me. Elena looked at their clasped hands, then up at his face, illuminated by lantern light and shadow. This was a crossroads moment, she realized. She could play it safe, retreat back to her comfortable existence of quiet spinsterhood and predictable disappointments. Or she could leap into the unknown with a complicated man who made her feel more in one evening than she'd felt in years. Yes, she heard herself say, I'm willing. Over the following weeks, Elena and James embarked on what society would surely have called a courtship, had they known about it. But the two of them maintained the careful fiction of casual acquaintance, meeting only in public settings where propriety could be observed, with Beatrice frequently serving as an unwitting, or perhaps entirely witting, chaperone. They attended lectures at the Royal Society, where James's knowledge of classical architecture complemented Elena's interest in scientific discovery. They browsed the bookshops of Piccadilly, debating philosophy and literature with the passion of old friends. They took promenades in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour, discussing everything from politics to poetry, while the ton looked on with varying degrees of interest and speculation. And slowly, carefully, they began to lower their defences. Elena learned that James had a dry sense of humour that emerged when he felt comfortable, and a passion for social reform that surprised her, given his aristocratic background. He championed causes for the working poor, had implemented progressive practices on his estates, and genuinely cared about the welfare of those dependent on him. James discovered that Elena was not only intelligent but deeply compassionate, that her occasional boldness masked a tender heart that felt things acutely. She volunteered at the Ladies' Education Society not for social credit, but because she genuinely believed in the transformative power of knowledge. She read voraciously not to impress others, but to understand the world and her place in it. You're wasted on London society, James told her one afternoon as they strolled through the British Museum. They were examining the Elgin marbles, and Elena had been enthusiastically explaining the historical context, while James watched her with undisguised admiration. Because I care about more than fashion and marriage prospects, Elena asked with a smile. Because you have a mind that deserves to be challenged and engaged, not stifled by tea parties and trivial conversation. Not everyone in society is trivial, James. Many people simply don't have the freedom to pursue their interests as openly as you and I do. That's generous of you, more generous than I feel toward most of them. Because you see them as judges and spectators, I try to see them as fellow prisoners of circumstance. He caught her hand, mindful of the other museum visitors, but unable to resist the gesture. This is why I need you, Elena. You remind me to be better than my cynicism. And you remind me to be braver than my caution, she replied. Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, Elena knew with absolute certainty that this had moved beyond friendship. The question was whether James was ready to acknowledge it. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. James had invited Elena to view his London townhouse library, a collection he'd mentioned rivaled even the British Museum for its rare manuscripts and first editions. Elena's mother, thrilled at what she perceived as a courtship finally developing, had given her blessing for the visit, provided Beatrice accompanied her as chaperone. But Beatrice, in a conspiracy Elena later suspected had been orchestrated by Lady Ashford, developed a sudden headache and remained in the morning room, leaving Elena and James alone in the vast library. "This is improper," Elena said, though she made no move to leave. "Terribly," James agreed, gesturing to a shelf of ancient Greek texts. "These are the manuscripts I mentioned, some date back to the 4th century. For a while they maintained the pretense, discussing books and sharing recommendations. But the air between them was charged with awareness, with all the things left unsaid over the past weeks. "Elena," James said finally, setting down the volume he'd been showing her, "we need to talk about what's happening between us." "Do we?" Elena asked, her heart suddenly racing. "Can't we just continue as we have been?" "No, because I'm lying to you and I'm lying to myself, and I can't do it anymore." He crossed the room to where she stood by the window, the grey London rain providing a melancholy backdrop. "I told you I couldn't promise more than friendship," he said, "but the truth is, somewhere in the past weeks you've become more than a friend to me. And I hope I've become more than a friend to you." Elena's breath caught. "James." "Let me finish, please." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of agitation. "I'm not good at this. Caroline and I married young, our betrothal arranged by our parents. I never had to court anyone, never had to navigate the uncertainty of not knowing if my feelings were returned. And I'm terrified, Elena. Terrified of caring for someone again only to lose them. Terrified of failing again." "You didn't fail Caroline," Elena said firmly. "You loved her, that's not failure." "I couldn't save her." "She didn't need saving. She made her own choices, even if they led to tragedy. You can't take responsibility for that." "I know that, intellectually I know it, but my heart," he pressed a fist against his chest. "My heart is still afraid." Elena stepped closer, taking his hand in both of hers. "I'm afraid too. Afraid of being hurt, of being disappointed, of giving my heart to someone who can't fully return it. But I'm more afraid of living my entire life playing it safe, never taking the risk, never knowing what might have been. You deserve someone who can give you everything, someone whose heart isn't damaged and complicated." "I don't want someone uncomplicated, James. I want you, damaged heart and all, if you'll have me." For a long moment he simply stared at her, and Elena could see the war playing out across his features. Fear battling hope, duty fighting desire. Then, with a sound that was half laugh, half sob, he pulled her into his arms. "God help us both," he whispered against her hair. "But yes, I'll have you if you're certain this is what you want." "I've never been more certain of anything." He pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands, his grey eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "I'm going to court you," he said. "Properly, publicly. I'm going to ask your father for permission to pay my addresses, and I'm going to show all of London that you're mine." "Rather possessive, Your Grace." "You have no idea," he murmured, and then he was kissing her. It was nothing like the chaste kisses Elena had imagined. This was fire and passion and tenderness all at once, years of loneliness and longing poured into one perfect moment. His lips moved against hers with a desperate hunger that she matched, her fingers tangling in his hair as she pulled him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "I should apologize," he said raggedly. "That was highly improper." "Don't you dare apologize," Elena commanded, making him laugh. "Bossy, I like it." "Good, because I intend to be very bossy about a great many things." "I wouldn't expect anything less." They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the rain against the windows and savoring the momentous shift that had just occurred. "What happens now?" Elena asked eventually. Now I speak to your father. We announce a proper courtship. We endure the gossip and speculation with dignity. And if you'll have me, Eleanor Hartley, in 6 months' time I'll make you a duchess." 6 months, why so long?" "Because I want to do this right. I want to give you a proper courtship, time to be certain of your feelings, time for us both to be certain." "I'm already certain." "Then the 6 months will fly by." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Besides, it will give us time to plan that trip to Italy I promised you." "As my husband rather than my friend." "Precisely, far more respectable that way." Elena laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "When did you become so concerned with respectability?" When I fell in love with a woman whose reputation matters more to me than my own. The casual declaration stole Elena's breath. You love me. James pulled back to look at her properly, his expression tender and open in a way she'd never seen before. Elena, I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment you marched across that ballroom and demanded I dance with you. You brought light back into a life I'd convinced myself was meant to be lived in shadows. How could I not love you? Tears spilled down Elena's cheeks, but she was smiling. I love you too, even when you were being rude. Especially when I was being interestingly rude, he corrected with a grin. That's when I'm most myself. Then I look forward to a lifetime of interestingly rude remarks. And I look forward to a lifetime of you challenging every single one of them. He kissed her again, more gently this time, a promise of all the kisses yet to come. From the doorway came a delicate cough. They sprang apart to find Beatrice standing there, looking entirely too pleased with herself. Feeling better? Elena asked. Much better, thank you. I thought I should check on you two before the scandal becomes utterly irredeemable. She glanced between them, taking in their flushed faces and guilty expressions. Though I see I may be too late for that. Lady Beatrice, James said with as much dignity as he could muster, I assure you my intentions toward Miss Hartley are entirely honourable. Of course they are. Now come along, Elena. Your mother will be wondering what's taking so long. And your Grace, I expect to see you calling on Mr. Hartley very soon. Tomorrow, James promised, first thing. The Venetian sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose as Elena stood on the balcony of their rented palazzo, watching gondolas glide past on the canal below. Behind her, she heard James emerge from their room, his footsteps familiar and beloved. There you are, he murmured, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. I woke and you were gone. I was worried. Just watching the sunset, Elena replied, leaning into his warmth. I wanted to savor it. We leave for Greece tomorrow. We can stay longer if you wish. We're not on anyone's schedule but our own. No, I'm ready for Greece, ready for whatever comes next. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the light fade over the ancient city. A year ago, Elena had been a spinster resigned to a quiet life of books and charitable work. Now she was a duchess, a wife, a partner in every sense of the word. The wedding had been intimate, held at the small church near James's country estate. Elena's father had walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, proud of his daughter for finding not just a husband, but a true partner. Beatrice had served as matron of honour, of course, taking full credit for the match despite having done nothing more than dare Elena to be brave. And now here they were, finally taking that trip to Italy James had promised. They'd spent a month in Rome, marvelling at the ancient ruins and Renaissance art. Another month in Florence, where James had commissioned a portrait of Elena, not as a duchess, but simply as herself, surrounded by the books she loved. What are you thinking? James asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. That I'm happy, Elena replied simply. Extraordinarily, ridiculously happy. Even with an interestingly rude husband. Especially with an interestingly rude husband. He turned her in his arms, and in the fading light she could see the love in his grey eyes, unclouded now by grief or fear. Thank you, he said. For what? For being brave enough to approach me that night, for seeing past the Duke to the man, for loving me even when I was too afraid to love you back. You were never too afraid, Elena corrected. Just careful, there's a difference. Careful with your heart, which I promised to guard with my life. And I yours, Elena vowed, rising on her toes to kiss him. The sun slipped below the horizon, casting Venice into twilight. But on their balcony, wrapped in each other's arms, Elena and James barely noticed. It was more than enough to guide them through whatever adventures lay ahead.